Hello, chess friends, and welcome to the Chess channel, and welcome back to the new In Chess Classic tournament in 2021. We have reached now the semi-final stage, and now the pairings of the semi-finals are Levon Aronian versus Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura against Shakhrem Mamedjanov. So we're following now the first match game. It's the match game between Levon Aronian against Magnus Carlsen. The first two games of the day one ended in a draw. Then Magnus Carlsen managed to win a game in a total equalish endgame, and then Levon Aronian made a huge blunder, got punished. So Magnus Carlsen, before the round 4, had a comfortable 1-point lead and ended the game 4. That's the game that we're covering now. We have really some beautiful tactics all over the board. Be prepared. This was, in my opinion, the best game from the day one of the semi-final stage. So let's check out now the game. D4 played by Levon. We have knight to f6, knight to f3, e6. We have bishop to f4. The London system is on the board. Many times in this particular tournament, Levon Aronian tried the London system. Now Magnus Carlsen plays the move b6, goes into Queen's Indian structures. The Queen's Indian structures mean, of course, that we're trying bishop to b7, occupying the square e4. If c4 and then knight to c3 will happen, we will use also our bishop's activity, pinning the knight, which is controlling the e4 square, and simply from the first couple of moves we are simply trying to get the powerful control of the e4 square. So that's why it's a Queen's Indian structure against the London system setup that here Levon Aronian has built here. But of course white is delaying the move c4 and knight to c3, waiting a little bit, because if you try now bishop to b4, still we have the flexibility to play the move c3, bishop to b7, bishop to d3, bishop to e7, and now the common London system move h3. We want to have a breathing space here for our bishop. If the bishop gets challenged with knight to h5, then we can hide, of course, to h2. So c5, c3, very pragmatic stuff also by white, building this fortress on dark squares. It's a common idea, of course, by white, building these types of fortresses on dark squares, still with great activities of both bishops. So the bishop is d3 is perfectly fine. Also the bishop on f4 is perfectly fine. Now the pawn structure is settled, and now in the continuation of the game, Magnus tries now c takes d4, e takes d4, and now castling also by Levon Aronian. We have now d6. It's a very often played line. It's now really structure which will the structure that will apply now. It's simply the hedgehog formation that Magnus Carlsen is building here, putting this 4 pawns on the 6th rank. I've seen many times Anatoly Karpov playing these types of structures. Anatoly Karpov was really a great positional player, although it seems so that the move d6 is passive. But first of all, what you should know is these 2 centralized pawns are taking over here in the center this 4 centralized squares. So now no minor piece activity for white there. So that's why it's a very nice positional setup, never ever allowing these minor pieces of white to occupy maybe the 5th rank somehow. So it's a restriction idea, but what you don't have, of course, in these types of structures is space. I think the lack of this structure is simply the lack of development. I think what white should do here simply is getting more and more space whenever it's possible, simply pushing the pawns somewhere maybe to the 5th rank. What we should do, where to attack, when we ask ourselves the question where should we attack here from white perspective, I think we should use simply here the pawn majority on the queen side. It means now playing on this 3 versus 2 idea on the queen side. What black should do, I think, is to try and prepare an e5 pawn breakthrough. The e5 pawn breakthrough is very often idea of blacks to break it there. If black manages to get it somehow with some activity, I think from that point on black could have a decent and pleasant game. So here rook to e1. So you see first Levon Aronian blocks out the potential e5, getting the rook on a natural square. We have knight to d7, and now a4. There is now really the serious threat of if you, for instance, I don't know, maybe play, let's see, maybe passive move, then you could risk also this idea, a5, sacrificing the pawn, but then after b takes a5, then the knight could come here, maybe here to a3 and then to c4, and I think we would have the opportunity to recapture the pawn on a5, and then black is left with an isolated pawn on a7. So it's something that white is trying to do to create some weaknesses. A weakness in the position can be a weak square or a weak pawn. I think in this particular scenario white would find a great way to maybe leave the isolated pawn on a7 in black's position, and I think then we have a clear target where to attack. So that's why after move a4, Magnus plays now the common hedgehog move. It's the move a6. Now if you want to, of course, to push the pawn with a5, then we're simply passing through with b5, and I think black has solved all of the positional problems on the queen side, which is basically black's idea. Now black could counterplay with the normal e5 idea. So that's why after move a4, a6, now we have the so-called hedgehog formation. So these 4 pawns are restricting all of the squares of white, no minor piece activity there. It's, as I said, a great restriction idea, but you don't have so much space, I think. So in the continuation, bishop to g3 here by Aronian, very nice and pragmatic idea, fixing the bishop on g3, because if the e5 move somehow comes, then at least this e5 doesn't come with a tempo. I think it's a great choice here, because you could try maybe here to kick away the bishop with knight to h5, bishop to h2, and many times I've played this position. My opponent in one game tried to move knight to f6. It wasn't, of course, the same position, but it was a similar position which applied from the Tory attack. After move knight to f6, what black is always hoping for is to play something like, I don't know, knight to d5, knight to f4, cementing one of these knights on this very active square, then to play something like rook to a7, and then queen to a8, and building this very powerful queen and bishop battery, and is trying, as I said, to cement simply one of these knights on f4. And then if black manages to do it, then black has, I think, a great game. But the problem is now with the move knight to f6, you get this trap g4. So I played really one game like this, and my opponent resigned immediately after the move g4. So that's why you have to be careful. There are maybe some different paths with knight to d4, d5, and then trying maybe to occupy the f4 square, but so far not possible. With maybe knight to d5, then f4, and f5, f4 is also black's opportunity somehow to get some space on the king side. As I said, on the queen side, black should simply play on the restriction idea. So that's why after a6 and bishop to g3 here, Magnus right, rook to e8, and now knight to a3, we have bishop to f8. Here Magnus is really trying now to get this e5 pawn break, so maybe it can be supported with g6, bishop to g7, and then maybe maneuver the knight somewhere, and then try really this e5 pawn break. So in the continuation, we have knight to c4, and now queen to c7 played by Magnus Carlsen, and now knight to d2. Here Levon Aronian simply improves the position of this knight, and now already one of the critical moments of the game appeared, because here Magnus Carlsen tried to move b5, and I think it wasn't the best of choices here by the world champion, because as I said, our goal on the queen side is simply to play on a restriction. We shouldn't provoke some weaknesses here. We should never allow maybe here white to create some isolated pawns. A better continuation is simply to push the pawn on e5, and it leads now really into a complicated line. It's simply a stockfish brutal line, and really I don't like to analyze these games what the stockfish engine suggests, but actually e5 is really here possible. It leads now into a very complicated line. As I said, it's not my style to show you this particular tactics that the stockfish engine is suggesting, but now after knight to e5, it leads now into a really brutal line. Knight to c4, attacking the pawn on e5, now queen to f3, queen to c6, attacking here the pawn on g2, simply threatening checkmate, bishop to f1, then rook to d8, queen to c2, knight to e4. Look at this tactics. Now knight takes e5, rook takes e5, bishop to e5, now something like knight to d2. This is simply sick chess. So as I said, this is a rapid online chess, so I'm not sure who can see this kind of stuff. So knight to d2, simply attacking the bishop again, threatening knight takes f1, followed with queen takes g2. So here f3 would be a fourth on knight, queen to c5, bishop to d4 is not a possibility. Black will sacrifice simply another rook, so that's why here king to h1, now knight takes f1, and now b4 is the suggested line by the engine, and now knight to e3, counter-attacking against the queen on c2. Look at this sick stuff. It's a really sick chess. So queen to e4 here, both players maybe would have the opportunity to take out the queens. Bishop to c5, f takes e4, and now after rook to e8, here bishop to d4 wouldn't be a possibility, because you get simply knight to c2, and it leads now, I think, into an equalish game where probably the game will end with some rook and pawn, and rook and pawn. So really this is not the style, but I wanted to show you how basically an e5 move here would be actually possible. Maybe Magnus is really familiar with this line. Maybe he wanted to spice up some things here. After move knight to d2, Magnus plays now the move b5, and actually allows now Levon Aronian to create very isolated pawn here on a6. It's now long-term weakness. This is a weakness, and I think white didn't lose any mobility of these pawns. These pawns are very good still. They're protected. They're building a very powerful pawn chain. Still, the activity of white pieces is perfectly fine. The bishop is great. This bishop is great. The knights will occupy the centralized square, so it's a great setup here for Levon Aronian, and already a much better position. So I've removed queen to a4, bishop to c6, queen to c2, and now Magnus plays a very tricky move, queen to b7, which actually was a mistake, because it seems so that this is very dangerous because you're attacking the pawn on g2. But here Levon Aronian prepared a great move, knight to c4, and you cannot take really the pawn on g2 because you get knight to a5. That's the main issue here. If you try queen to d5, that's the only square that protects the bishop on g2. Then you get bishop to c4, and something that you should resign. Queen to g5 is the possibility. Then we can take out simply the bishop, and you can try maybe knight to h5, but knight to f3 solves, I think, all of the positional and tactical problems in white's game. And now we should simply, from black's perspective here, resign. White is up a whole piece. So really wild tactic here that Levon Aronian has prepared. Never ever allow this idea bishop takes g2, and the cool part about this tactic that he doesn't have to weaken the pawn structure with move f3. That's, I think, a great counterplay here by Levon. We have queen to c7. You see Magnus moves the queen where the queen was already, so it's not a good choice here. Knight to a5. Levon Aronian simply attacks the bishop. Rook to a7, and now knight to c6. We have queen to c6, and now comes really a great move here by Levon Aronian, really a top grandmaster move, b4. And this move really surprised me. Dude, why are you leaving your backward pawn here? It's of course a long-term weakness, and I was thinking what should happen if, for instance, black tries the move d5. d5 seemed to me in the beginning immediately like a normal move, because you would never be able to push the pawn on c4. This pawn on c3 will be a long-term weakness, but actually there is now a great tactic, rook takes a6. That's, I think, a great tactic that Levon has prepared. After rook takes a6, we have now b5. You have to move the queen, and now this is a passer with the support of the rook, with the support of the bishop, with the support of this bishop. This pass pawn is simply too much to handle. It's a position that black should resign. So really brilliant stuff. b4 move here. You see now after move rook to c8, you cannot play d5. Now Levon Aronian has the opportunity to occupy the c4 square, and he has now 3 connected pawns here in the center. These are mobile pawns. These pawns are rolling all over the board. They are supported. What's the great thing? Supported by the bishops. That's actually a great part. Supported by the rooks, of course, with maybe rook to b1, rook to c1. This is now a great restriction. This is now powerful central control by white. So after move e5, as we said, it comes a little bit too late. This move e5, d takes e5, knight to e5, bishop to f1. Here by Levon Aronian, he simply hides with his bishop. So you see, he has played, Levon has so far played the move h3, so he still has opportunities to, of course, move the bishop to h2, and this bishop is also on f1. Although these bishops are maybe on the first and second rank, but of course the bishops are long range pieces, so they're still attacking, but they can be hidden and they cannot be attacked by this knight. Great setup here by Levon Aronian. So rook to b7, attacking the pawn, queen to b3, rook to b8, and now b5. Here Levon Aronian creates a pass pawn, queen to b6, knight to c4. There are maybe some better lines. Again, the engine suggests something like queen to d1, getting out of the range, maybe on the b file, rook to b1, then followed with maybe a knight to e4, rook to e4, maybe getting something like rook to a4, rook to a6. But okay, it's not a problem here. Knight to c4, a simplifying idea by Levon Aronian, still has a better position. Knight takes c4, bishop to c4. The bishops love, of course, these types of structures because it's an asymmetrical pawn structure. The problem is now this is a very annoying pass pawn. If this pawn would be here on d5, if the pawn structure would be symmetrical with 3 pawns maybe on the king side and maybe decentralized pawns maybe on d5 and d6, then I think it would be equalish game, because you cannot create dynamics, you cannot open the position. Now with this asymmetrical pawn structures, the bishops have a pleasant game, I think. So rook to c8 here by Magnus Carlsen. We have rook to a6, as we said, attacking the queen, simply queen to c5, bishop to d3. Here we have d5, and now bishop to f4, knight to e4, bishop to e3, and now d4 here also by Magnus. You can maybe simplify the game with bishop takes d4, queen to d4, and now with bishop to e4, maybe then afterwards cementing somehow our bishop on c6, protecting the pawn on b5. I think this would be also a very good continuation here for white. But what Levon Aronian is not doing here, of course, is that the game leads now into opposite colored bishops, because many times in this opposite colored bishops endgames, the game ends in a draw. And it shows now basically that Levon Aronian is going for a win. So as I said, this would be a normal line. He is a pawn up. I don't think that you can lose the game, but I don't think you can win this game so easily. So that's why the idea to go bishop to e4 is perfect. Bishop to f4 here is perfectly fine. So knight to c3 by Magnus, attacking the pawn. We have rook to e5, a great counter attack here again by Levon Aronian. Queen to b4, queen takes b4, bishop to b4, and now g4, creating some breathing spaces for the king. Still everything is protected, and now g6. Magnus is also liberating some squares for the king. Maybe then black can play much more freely with the king. Then you're not vulnerable maybe to some bankrupt checkmate. So both players have created breathing spaces for the king. And now in the continuation of the game here, king to g2, improving simply the position of the king. Rook to b8, attacking the pawn, and now rook to e1, attacking the rook, of course. Attacking the rook with the move rook to e1. The bishop diagonal has opened now. Rook to d8 again by Magnus, and now bishop to g5. We have rook to b8 again, bishop to f4, some perpetuals again. Here Levon Aronian tried rook to e5, rook to b8, and now rook to c6. Leaving a little bit this pawn hanging, but again, after rook to d5, what Levon Aronian has here is really sort of a net, building really a nice spider web here with rook to d5, rook to c6, bishop to d3, bishop to f4. All of these very strong pieces are now very active. Of course, white is down a pawn, but the activity of white's pieces is simply too much to handle. First of all, what we should notice, there are always this kind of tactics, maybe something to play bishop to h6 or bishop to e5, then maybe trade here some pieces on b5, and then you could also get this back rank checkmate. So that's why you have to be careful. In the continuation, Magnus tried now the move knight to a7, counter-attacking the rook, but it's not a problem. The knight is now on the edge of the board, and of course the knight is never good on the edge of the board. There are maybe some occasions, but it's not such a good occasion here. After move knight to a7, rook to c1, again attacking here the rook on b8, again rook to e8 here, and now rook to b1, creating this very important pin. Rook to b6. What Levon Aronian is, what Magnus Carlsen is hoping for is to maybe get somehow bishop to c5 or bishop to a5, trading off the rook, somehow simplify the game, because what black is hoping for here is the simplification, trading off more and more pieces and going maybe into an endgame with plus a pawn. But here Levon Aronian plays the move bishop to c7, attacks further the rook. We have rook to c6, and now rook to d7. You see, it's now very easy for white to play to find the best next moves. The rook is again active, bishop is very active on d3, creates also this very powerful blockade around the square d4, because the pawn can never be advanced. And you see the bishop is a great defensive piece, but also a great attacking piece. So here rook to e7. Magnus is again trying to simplify the position by trading off some more pieces, but of course Levon Aronian is not interested in that scenario. Rook to d8, king to g7, and now bishop to f4. Trying some other path for the bishop, trying maybe if the rook moves some, maybe bishop to e5 ideas. In the continuation of the game, bishop to a5 played by Magnus, rook to a8, attacking the knight. We have rook to c8, and now rook to b8, and here Magnus Carlsen hoped again for some trading pieces here. After bishop to b8, we have now bishop to b6, and this was now a huge blunder also by the world champion. Again, knight to c6, slightly better here. We're defending, but we're getting also our knight into the game. It's very important now to include the knight into the game. Knight to c6 would be an accurate move. Then maybe something like bishop to d6, counterattack here, rook to d7. Again, you would be forced maybe here to play bishop to f8. And the cool part for black is here that you could actually play here the move bishop to king to g8, because here bishop to b4, the discovered attack is not so dangerous. We can simply try here rook to d8 and simplify the position again by trading some more pieces. If you try rook to d8, then bishop to d8 is a possibility, and it's simply a drawish line, I think. So bishop to b6 would be the correct move, but Magnus, pardon me, knight to c6, as we said, but he played bishop to b6, and now bishop to d6 here, played by Levon Aronian, simply attacking. We have bishop to f8. Now the king has to move, because if you would have moved now the king to g8, there is now the great discovered attack with bishop to c5, and the game is simply over. If you try now to cover, of course, then we can simply takes, and now we can take out the knight. So as I said, knight to c6 was simply a huge opportunity to defend this position. After move bishop to f8, here Magnus has to go now with the king on f6, and you see now this is really, as the title says, a spider web. The king is very dangerous here. We can play f4 g5, really wild stuff. And now Levon Aronian makes a huge inaccuracy. He plays the move rook to b8. It's not the best of moves. You have to cut off here the king's ability to escape with rook to e8, and it leads now, you could play maybe again knight to c6, but now bishop to b5, pinning. It's not the same position. Bishop to c6, bishop to b5, attacking the knight here on c6 would be a great opportunity. You can maybe escape, you can maybe defend, but now bishop to d6 is, I think, a great move. You can maybe here try knight to e7 to counterplay somehow, but here you would lose simply the rook after bishop takes c7. It's much better. Of course, black has this extra pawn, but you're down the exchange, and that's why here, as we said, rook to e8 would be a great opportunity. This knight would be simply out of game. So the knight on c6 defensive idea of black is simply not working here. So that's why here, after move rook to b8, Magnus Carlsen had the opportunity to play bishop to d8, locking finally this back rank, which unfortunately for Magnus he did not. So bishop to d8, the only defensive move. He played now bishop to e5, and from this point on it's game over, because now finally Levon Aronian plays this idea of rook to e8, bishop to c7. Again, you see the knight is simply out of game, and now with the move h4 we're threatening g5. Really wild stuff. So here Max tries g5 himself, but now bishop to f5, attacking simply the rook to d5. We have bishop to e7. You see now how easy it is to play the game, and now bishop to c5, the discovered attack. So I see how problematic it was, because the knight was simply on the edge of the board. Discovered attack, great discovered attack, king to f6, and now h takes g5, king to g5, and this is now completely winning game here for Levon. Bishop to a7, d3, bishop to e3 comes with the check. Still we have this protection of the d2. In the continuation here, Magnus tried king to f6, and now bishop to d2, blocking the position out. Great move here by Aronian. We have h5, bishop to e4 comes again with the threat. We have rook to b5, and here after move g5 in this position, Magnus Carlsen resigns. So you have to sacrifice the rook for the pawn, and then bishop takes g5 will happen, and we're continuing the game here from white's perspective, up a whole rook. So great game by Levon Aronian. Great attack. As I said, it was really a game all over the board. You see the stockfish lines, it's really brutal. These are lines, I think they're happening very often. These lines appear to me when I played many times the Torre attack against Queen's Indian setups. Of course, it's not the London, but it's a bishop's opening, sort of the Torre attack in the London system. So I think this game will be very instructive for me, because as I said, I played this position many times, and I think I know something more about these types of structures and these types of positions. So that's why we'll add also this game into your London system series. If you want to study more the London system series, please check out my series from the beginning. I've analyzed the London from white's perspective, with some other opportunities for white, with also some other defenses by black. Please check it out. If you want to have maybe a nice opening repertoire as white, you can study the whole series. And if you want to see more games from this tournament, check out my also other commented games so far. Here are some great games that we covered before. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.